Hey guys, this is Dan from learningcameras.com, and here we have the brand new Nikon D600. We're going to take a review of this unit, stack it up against some of the other cameras out there. I know the big camera out there is the Canon 6D that's up on the horizon. It's not out yet, so we can't compare it. We'll try and do a more in-depth comparison when it does come out. Overall, the Nikon D600 looks like it's going to be a better competitor, especially if you're looking at getting into the pro market or looking as a second body for a pro camera, because of the capabilities that it has in it. The spec sheet is an unbelievable readout. They hardly limited anything on it from the Nikon D800, and overall it's like a D800 stuffed with a couple features missing into a body the size of the Nikon D7000. I'm really excited to see what this camera is capable of. Everything on it seems to be unbelievable. We're going to explore everything from the body to the image quality, and we'll take some direct ISO comparisons and take a look at the results. So as we take a look around the device, there's a couple things we can note. The overall controls are very similar to the D7000. You have your basic controls right over here and your wheel up top, unlike the D800. Most of your controls are really going to be just like the D7000. Now, a couple things to note is, just like a D7000, we also have our ISO button and our zoom controls linked together. This was a big problem for me, because if I wanted to change the ISO very quickly after taking the picture and I had on image review, then it meant I had to either hit the play button again to get out of image review, or that shutter button halfway before I could even change the ISO. Now, other than that, the controls are very easy to use. The grip is very comfortable in the hand. If you come from a Canon body, it's going to be a little bit small of a grip right where the thumb is. There's just a tiny slot in here. Canon normally allows for a little bit more, but you do have your control wheel right up here where your thumb is, unlike the Canon that's over on this side here. So everything is very easy to reach and right where you would think it would be. Now, as we take a look at the right side, we do have this big asset on the dual SD card slots. If you're coming from a Nikon camera, pretty much every Nikon camera now has dual SD card slots or a compact flash, at least 2 card slots of some kind. Canon, though, the D70 does not have it. The new 6D that's going to be a competitor to this camera does not have it. And the 5D Mark II does not have it. And so this is a big asset that Nikon has that Canon does not. Nothing big on the front of the device. You do have an AF assist on there, and you do have a flash on the top. Those are pretty big. Canon doesn't do that on any of their models that are in this kind of range. Only the 7D, but that's a crop sensor camera. So as we take a look on the other side of the device, this now has a locking control wheel. It is a bit tough to press. Not a big deal for this one. This one is even tougher to press, especially with one hand. I normally need 2 to get it going. They're not something that you change a lot, so it's not a big deal. But I wish it was a little bit easier to click. I mean, I don't think that you accidentally do this very easily anyway. Now, we do have a mic port, and these controls right here, these access ports, they're very heavy duty. They're not quite as much as the Nikon D800 or the D4 or something like that, but it is much better than what Canon offers. And so I did find that these were very easy to open. And also you have your mic and your headphone jack right in there, and those are new for that. You have your USB and HDMI, as well as your GPS option right down in here. Once again, everything looks pretty good with this camera. The top pop-up flash is a very welcome thing. Even though I probably wouldn't use it as a flash, it can be very helpful for controlling other flashes. Now, I did notice that up in the top, you cannot actually have a, let me turn the light on, see if that helps a little bit, but you don't actually have an exposure reading on that. The only way to find your exposure is going to be to look through the viewfinder or through the back LCD screen. But as soon as you take a picture or hit the shutter halfway, the back LCD screen disappears and you have to hit your info button again to get your exposure readout. So if you're looking through the viewfinder, not a big problem. If you have it on a tripod or something like that where you don't have it looking through the viewfinder, this can be a little bit of an issue for you. I found I was commonly hitting the info button when shooting on a tripod. Not something that I love to see. I wish I could keep the screen on all the time for things like that, or that I at least had an exposure reading in the top screen. But I find that this is a little bit jumbled and not as easy to read as this nice layout here. It is a bit more complicated than what Canon shows on theirs, and it's not as well organized, but it does show you everything, and it shows you it much larger than if you were trying to look through the top LCD. So basically, an overall, the hardware is great, the camera feels great. It's a magnesium alloy body for most of it. The only thing it's not is the front, but that's pretty much protected by the lens. This part will be plastic. Overall, the grips feel good, the body feels good. It's very small and light. So it kind of feels a little bit less like a pro camera just because it's so small and light, but the build quality is definitely up to par with Nikon's best cameras. So as we take a look at the test that we did here, I've got a outside file, and we'll take a look and compare it with a 100 ISO file and then the higher ISO file. Now all of these were raw files that were just processed in the JPEG to open up a little bit quicker. And as we take in with no noise reduction or anything like that applied to them. Now as we take a look at the files, even at 1600 ISO, which is what the file on the right is, everything looks very, very nice. You can hardly see any grain in any areas. There's a tiny bit, but it's almost negligible. And even looking around the image into the foreground areas, everything looks great. There's a tiny bit of color noise that we're seeing into here, a tiny bit of grain, but you can hardly tell. And everything in the sharp areas is definitely very sharp. No noticeable difference between the two files at all. That's pretty impressive that ISO 100 is looking like 1600. Now these are outside, so it's going to be kind of a best case scenario. But as we take this up and we bring the ISO and a 3200 ISO file, and we take a look at those differences. Now we begin to see a little bit of loss of detail. There's some detail right here in this light pole that I'm missing on this image, but it's very mild. You would hardly notice this in a normal picture. There is a tiny bit of grain in here, but once again, everything is very mild that we are seeing. And yeah, overall everything looks very good in the areas. We are seeing some differences in sharpness on it. You can see some grain looks here, and actually it kind of looks like it's sharper just because you're seeing the grain. It almost looks like we've added sharpening on it. It's a very film noise type look to it. So not a lot of difference, and it definitely looks like there's a change in sharpness just because of the amount of grain that we have on there. But overall the images look very good. Now as we take a look and bring that into ISO 6400, at 6400, when we zoom in here, we're definitely losing some detail in here. It doesn't look quite as good. Even these pins right here are starting to show. We do have noticeable grain in the image, but once again we're zoomed in at 100% on this. So when we take it out, you really can't tell the difference at all. When we take a look at the color noise, it's starting to show up a little bit worse. And so this seems to be the difference where it really starts to show in an outside picture, that we're able to see that kind of a difference. Now even at high 1, and I will tell you this, that when you're shooting at high 1, it actually gives no ISO value to it. This is 12,800, but anything over 6,000 is not gonna, anything over 6,400 is not gonna give an ISO value at all. I wish they had gone higher on that because I want to be able to see what ISO I'm shooting this at, so that I know it's not at ISO 100, or I know it's at 6400, or I know what it is, but I have no idea when looking at this file. Now here we are losing quite a bit on it. I probably wouldn't shoot at this unless you absolutely had to. Overall though, this is way better than we've seen in most other cameras on this, but this is a full frame camera, mind you, so many full frame cameras kind of held up around this level, but we are seeing about a stop better than I'm used to in something like a Canon 5D Mark II, for example. Now when we look at these car files, this is a little darker area, and so we're going to see the difference a little bit more. We've got ISO 100 on the left, or actually ISO 200 because I didn't do a 100, and then a 1600 on the right. Overall, when we take a look at these black areas, we're starting to see a tiny bit of loss in the black and a little bit of color noise. Only at 100%, we're not seeing anything other than that. Now let me show you this blue pixel right here. I did have a dead pixel. It's not showing up in ISO 100. Shows up everything more than that. It actually is there. It's just not very easy to see until it gets to about 200, 400 ISO. Then it shows up a lot. So overall though, honestly, in these black areas, we can hardly tell that there's a difference. It seems to be in these areas that are not quite black that we begin to see some color noise. Looks like color noise in there, but overall not bad at all. Now when we take that from ISO 1600 to 3200, now we begin to see some loss even in these black areas right here. We can see a little bit of color noise peeping in. Looks like I have another pixel that's out. Well, I didn't even see that one. So we have a red pixel out right here. That's not good. I've got two that I've seen so far in this camera, and I've only had it for 2 weeks. We are seeing what looks like more detail almost because of the film-like grain that we're seeing on the sensor on the high ISO shots. But everything does look pretty good at this level. It's starting to get a little destroyed over here, but nothing bad. At 100, only at 100% can we see any difference between the two files. Now let's take a look at 6400 again. And at 6400, this seems to be about the limit of what you would want to shoot at for anything you were printing big. At 100%, we're starting to see it. Now this is with no noise reduction. It will clean up nicely with it. We are starting to lose some detail in here. Not able to see that there's any lines in this area of the headlight up until about right here. But on this 200 ISO shot, I can see those pretty clearly. It doesn't seem to be anything very bad. I would shoot at this. I can see pretty much everything. I'm just losing a little bit of detail at 6400 that I wasn't losing before. Now my third shot, we'll go through really quickly because it didn't show up as well what I wanted to as the car shot. But we'll take a look at 100 and 3200 ISO for a little bit because I didn't want to show that 1600 looks good. When you get to 3200, you start to lose a tiny bit of detail. Let's look at these words right here, and we can see it's a little more blurred on the one to the right at the higher one. And then when we look at this word right here, I can still pretty much make it out here. And at 3200, I'm starting to lose it. But once again, it's still not gone. It's just a little bit less. Now when I take a look at 6400, it's starting to go even more. This is where you really start to lose a good amount of detail. This looks pretty blurry by comparison. None of this area is as sharp. So we are beginning to lose some of the detail here. Mind you, everything still looks very, very good. We can see some blurring right into this area here that's not in this area. This area looks very good on the image to the left. Now one last one, and this is high 1, which is 12,800. Once again, there's a pretty big noise increase at 12,800. I would still shoot here in a pinch. It's not horrible. Now when we take a look at these detail areas, this is pretty much gone. It's actually almost impossible to see this. So if you have a detailed shot, you wouldn't want to shoot at anything like this. The details are pretty gone. But in these highly lit areas, it just kind of comes under a faded look, but the detail is still enough there that I can read it. But really and truly, these don't look that good if you're looking for detail shots. Now when you're viewing it normally, really and truly, you can hardly see any grain on it. There's a little bit that you can see, but it's not really bad until you start to zoom in at 100%. So I would take this on the internet without a problem, and only hesitate if I was taking this into a large print or if I was cropping a lot into the image. So overall, performs very good at high ISOs, all the way up to 1600 where you don't even notice the difference, and all the way up to 6400 where you begin to lose some detail, but it's still very usable. And for internet shots, 12,800 seems to be a very usable number, although we can't tell what we're shooting at because it doesn't list it in the details of this. Now I'm actually recording on the D600 right now. This is also the built-in mic into the system, so we'll see how it sounds. I won't do any touching up to any of this for right now. So we'll just see what can happen straight out of the camera. Now when we take it outside, we're gonna just basically take a look at the kind of detail and resolution that it can capture. in comparison to some of the other cameras. We'll be doing a lot more tests shortly, so hang with me. I've got a 5D3 and a 5D2 hopefully that we'll put alongside with the 7D, and we'll try to get all of those tests out to you in the next week or two. So stay with me and let's take this outdoors. Hey, so real quickly, I just wanted to give you guys one heads up of something that I experienced when doing video. There seems to be a little bit of an issue I'm having, and that is I can't get an exposure on the video mode. There is nothing I can do to actually see what my exposure is when I am in live view doing video. This is a double problem on the Nikon D600 if there isn't a way to fix this. And the reason is because you cannot change the aperture control at all while in live view. I'm not talking about while shooting. That's fine. I don't change the aperture while shooting. You decide on it. Well, sometimes I would like to if I'm just doing some family videos, but for anything serious, you would never change the aperture while shooting. So that's not a big deal. But if you're in live view at all, you cannot change the aperture. That means if you're in live view, setting up a shot, doing video, every time you're like, oh man, I need some more light, so let me bring the aperture a little bit wider. You have to get out of live view, readjust your aperture, and then get back into live view in your video modes. So when you're out of live view, you're not getting the same settings. The camera switches back to your default photo settings, and so you're not actually seeing, even when you dial in the exposure to check the exposure while not in live view, you're not actually seeing it with the same settings you are in video unless you just match those up together. But it makes being able to switch between video and photos almost impossible. So this is an issue I'm having. If I come up with a fix, I'll let you know. If you guys have any help and tips or know what's going on other than the camera can't do it, please let me know and I'll go ahead and change this response. So here we are in Lightroom with a raw NEF file, and we're going to see what we can do with this. Now, typically when we take a file like this on a camera, there isn't a whole lot we can do if we're in something like JPEG. But with a raw file, and especially on a Nikon, there is probably a lot that we can do. Now, the D800 set records for what we were able to get out in dynamic range, and let's just take a look at this file. Lots of detail, even at 100%. I can definitely see everything extremely well. We're really into these trees here, and they're very, very far away. Overall, a nice looking file. Now let's see what we can do with this. Let's take our shadows and let's increase them to 100%. Now all of a sudden everything just came alive, and we can see all of this here. There's a tiny bit of noise. This was shot at ISO 400. I was hand holding it, and I shot probably a little faster than I needed, 2/50th, but I could have backed that down a little bit. I was at 50 millimeters, so I could have probably shot at ISO 200 in like a 1/125 of a second, and that would have been fine. But anyway, here it is, just a tiny bit of grain, but man, all of that information just came out of that grass, and we still have all of the detail on that. Now let's take these highlights and let's see what can happen as we pull these down. And here we pull our highlights and our whites down, and all of a sudden everything, we didn't lose anything, all in the highlights and in the shadow areas. As we see in our histogram, we preserved everything. Now when we look at the file beforehand, we can see that we were topping out on our highlights and topping out really on our shadows. Yep, our shadows were going to black over here, and our highlights were right there. We had everything that we needed in the shot, and we were able to bring all of that right back.
into our original file, and we can do so much with this file without losing it. We begin to lose a little bit around the sun area. I'm getting some halos if we go much up from the exposure from there. But overall, everything looks great. Adding a little bit of contrast to that, setting the white balance a little bit more what it should be, and overall this file looks absolutely amazing. Now let's see what happens when we do a little bit of noise reduction. Let me pull out my sharpening actually really quickly, and actually a lot of that noise just disappeared, so some of that was probably in the sharpening. And if we take the noise reduction and just add a tiny bit, I don't want to lose any detail on that. I start to lose a little bit of detail, but there I don't have any loss that I can visibly see, and I don't see any noise from anything in those shadows. Everything looks very, very good from that. So that's pretty impressive. We're getting quite a few stops from this camera. Overall, the sharpness is great. Everything looks unbelievable on the Nikon D600.
So there we have it, the Nikon D600 review. Overall, it's an unbelievably capable camera, rocking a 24 megapixel, unbelievable sensor. Images at 1600 look like ISO 100. Images all the way up to 6400 look great. Incredible amounts of dynamic range throughout all of your shooting ability. A very welcome dual SD card slot, as well as a headphone out. The problem is some usability issues that make this camera a little tough to use, especially for video shooters who can't change the aperture at all during live view, not just video capture, but live view, as well as a dead pixel that I found on my unit. That will probably mean that it's going to be going back to the store. Whether or not I get a replacement remains to be seen. Overall, it's a very capable camera. There are some on-screen issues, not being able to keep the screen on, not being able to see the exposure up top. Also some issues with where the ISO button is placed, similar to how the D7000 is. Those are issues I could probably get past if it wasn't for the changing aperture in the video mode and the dead pixel. I'd probably be keeping this camera. Overall though, you will never go wrong with the image quality on this camera. I'd recommend that you try it out, see if you can get past the little issues like that. If you can, overall you'll be blown away by the results of this body. I put it up next to the 7D. I'll probably do some side-by-sides against the 5D3 later on, so check that out, see if those are available. But overall, you will enjoy this camera. If you are doing any kind of travel or want a lightweight body, this is definitely the camera to get. Nothing else with a full frame camera will compete with it. The Canon 6D is going to be even more limiting in many ways than this body, although the video might be a little bit easier with Canon, because if they keep the same way that they do the live aperture as they do in all of their other cameras, you'll have a little better results on the Canon with that. But the image quality has blown me away, all the way up to ISO 1600, where I really thought that I was shooting at ISO 100. Let me know if you have any additional questions. Great camera, great price for a full frame camera. I hope Nikon can do something about the aperture and video mode, and overall if they can change a couple little things around in firmware, or if you can get past some of the settings and the way that you have to use it because of such a small body, then you will enjoy this camera thoroughly. Thanks for watching. This is Dan from LearningCameras.com.